The Soviet military police officer who stopped Lieutenant Colonel Frank Howley's convoy on the Autobahn approaching Berlin on June 24, 1948, informed the American commander with bureaucratic politeness that the road was closed for repairs and that no traffic would be permitted to pass until further notice. Howley, the American commandant of the American sector of Berlin, understood immediately that the road closure had nothing to do with repairs and everything to do with Soviet determination to force Western powers out of Berlin by cutting off land access to the isolated city deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. Within hours, reports arrived that Soviet forces had also closed the rail lines and canals connecting Berlin to Western Germany, implementing a complete blockade that would prevent supplies from reaching the 2.5 million residents of West Berlin who depended on deliveries from the West for food, fuel, medicine, and everything else required to sustain a major city. The Berlin blockade represented the culmination of tensions that had been building since 1945, when the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers had dissolved into confrontation over how to manage occupied Germany and how to organize post-war Europe. The agreements reached at Yalta and Potsdam during the final months of World War II had divided Germany into 4 occupation zones controlled by the Soviet Union, United States, Britain, and France, with Berlin similarly divided despite being located 110 miles inside the Soviet zone. The arrangement reflected wartime cooperation and assumptions that the victorious Allies would continue working together to rebuild Germany and Europe. But by 1948, those assumptions had been shattered by fundamental disagreements about Germany's political future and about whether Germany would remain divided or would be reunified. The immediate trigger for the blockade was Western introduction of currency reform in the 3 Western occupation zones designed to stabilize the German economy and to combat the hyperinflation that was crippling recovery. The Soviet Union had not been consulted about the currency reform and viewed it as a unilateral Western action that would create separate economic and eventually political systems in Western and Eastern Germany, making eventual reunification under terms acceptable to the Soviet Union impossible. Stalin's decision to blockade Berlin represented an attempt to force Western powers to abandon currency reform or to accept Soviet demands about Germany's future political organization, with the ultimate objective of forcing Western powers out of Berlin entirely by making the city's occupation untenable through starvation and economic collapse. The Western position in Berlin was extraordinarily vulnerable to Soviet pressure because every supply reaching the city had to cross Soviet-controlled territory using roads, railways, and canals that Soviet forces could close at will. Berlin's location deep inside the Soviet zone meant that defending the city militarily against Soviet ground forces would be impossible, given that the Western garrison numbered approximately 8,000 troops, while Soviet forces in Eastern Germany numbered over 300,000. Any military confrontation over Berlin would favor the Soviets overwhelmingly, and Western military planners understood that attempting to force the blockade militarily by sending armed convoys down the Autobahn would likely trigger combat that Western forces could not win without escalating to nuclear weapons, an option that political leaders considered but rejected as disproportionate to the stakes involved. The only access to Berlin that Soviet forces could not physically block without committing acts of war was the air corridors that had been established by agreement among the occupying powers in 1945. These corridors, 3 20-mile-wide aerial routes connecting Western Germany to Berlin, had been designated for civilian and military air traffic and were supposedly guaranteed by international agreement. Soviet forces could harass aircraft using the corridors through dangerous flying by Soviet fighters or through other intimidation tactics, but actually shooting down Western aircraft would constitute an act of war that Soviet leaders wanted to avoid while pursuing objectives through pressure and blockade rather than through military action. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor of Germany, immediately recognized that the air corridors provided the only realistic option for supplying Berlin during the blockade, despite the enormous logistical challenges involved in supplying a city of 2.5 million people entirely by air using 1948 technology and available aircraft. No city had ever been supplied entirely by air for more than brief periods, and the quantities of food, fuel, and other supplies required exceeded anything that had been attempted in previous airlift operations. But the alternative was either to abandon Berlin, handing Stalin a major propaganda victory and potentially beginning a cascade of Western retreats from positions in Europe, or to attempt military confrontation that would likely trigger war that nobody wanted and that might escalate to nuclear exchanges. The initial airlift operations beginning in late June 1948 were improvised and inadequate, limited by the small number of transport aircraft available and by lack of organization for sustained operations on the scale required. American C-47 Skytrain aircraft, the military version of the DC-3, could carry approximately 3 tons of cargo per flight, meaning that sustaining Berlin would require hundreds of flights daily, given that the city needed approximately 4,500 tons of supplies per day to maintain minimum subsistence levels. The early flights delivered perhaps 80 to 100 tons daily, barely 1% of what was needed, leading some observers to conclude that supplying Berlin entirely by air was impossible, and that the blockade would force Western withdrawal within weeks when food stocks were exhausted. But General Clay and General Curtis LeMay, commanding U.S. air forces in Europe, believed that the airlift could succeed if properly organized and if sufficient aircraft could be dedicated to the operation. Clay understood that failure to sustain Berlin would have catastrophic political consequences for Western credibility and for European confidence that the United States would defend them against Soviet pressure. LeMay, characteristically optimistic about what air power could achieve, believed that systematic application of airlift capabilities using every available aircraft flying maximum hours could deliver tonnages that would surprise skeptics who underestimated what determined efforts could accomplish. President Harry Truman, briefed about the blockade and about Clay's proposed airlift response, made the decision within days that the United States would commit whatever resources were necessary to sustain Berlin, despite the costs and despite the risks that Soviet interference with the airlift might trigger military confrontation. Truman understood that abandoning Berlin would validate Soviet aggression and would suggest to Europeans that American security guarantees were unreliable, undermining everything the United States had been trying to achieve in post-war Europe. The decision committed American prestige and credibility to sustaining an airlift that would become the largest humanitarian and logistical operation conducted entirely by air in history up to that point. The expansion of airlift operations during July and August 1948 saw American and British forces deploying additional aircraft to bases in Western Germany, establishing organized schedules for flights into Berlin, and developing procedures for loading, unloading, and maintaining aircraft that would allow sustained operations at rates far exceeding what had been achieved during the improvised early phase. The American C-54 Skymaster, a four-engine transport that could carry 10 tons of cargo compared to the C-47's 3 tons, became the primary aircraft for the airlift as more were diverted from other operations worldwide to support the Berlin mission. British forces contributed additional aircraft, including Dakotas and larger types, and the combined Anglo-American effort began delivering tonnages that approached though did not yet meet Berlin's minimum requirements. The organization of airlift operations evolved rapidly as commanders learned through experience what worked and what didn't when attempting to supply a major city entirely by air. The man who would become most identified with organizing the airlift success was Major General William Tunner, a logistics specialist who had commanded the China-Burma-India hump airlift during World War II, and who understood better than anyone how to organize sustained air transport operations. Tunner was assigned to command the airlift in late July 1948, and he immediately began implementing systematic procedures and standards that would transform the operation from improvised chaos into a precision system delivering maximum tonnage with minimum waste. Tunner's approach emphasized reducing aircraft turnaround time through standardized loading and unloading procedures, minimizing time aircraft spent on the ground to maximize flight hours. He established that each aircraft would be loaded with predetermined cargo configurations that balanced weight properly and that could be quickly transferred from loading vehicles to aircraft cargo bays. At Berlin's Tempelhof Airport and at the other airports receiving airlift flights, unloading would be performed by German workers under supervision of military personnel, with each aircraft spending maximum of 30 minutes on the ground before departing for return flights. The system treated aircraft like assembly lines, with standardized procedures at every stage, maximizing efficiency and throughput. The flight schedules that Tunner established treated the air corridors like invisible conveyor belts, with aircraft spaced at precise intervals, flying at assigned altitudes and speeds. Each aircraft entering the corridor at the western end would be directed to a specific altitude and would maintain precise spacing from aircraft ahead and behind, creating streams of aircraft flowing continuously toward Berlin. The system required extraordinary discipline from pilots who had to maintain exact speeds and altitudes regardless of weather or mechanical issues, with any aircraft unable to maintain schedule being directed to return to base rather than disrupting the stream by flying slower or at wrong altitude. The radio communications and air traffic control procedures developed for the airlift represented innovations that would influence civilian aviation for decades. The ground-controlled approach system that allowed controllers to talk aircraft down through clouds and darkness when pilots couldn't see the runway became standard for civilian airports worldwide after demonstrating its effectiveness during the airlift. The precision timing and spacing that allowed aircraft to land at Berlin airports at intervals of 90 seconds, far exceeding normal peacetime operations, showed what could be achieved through systematic organization and through pilots trained to follow procedures exactly without improvisation that might disrupt the flow. The challenges of sustaining airlift operations through winter 1948-1949 tested the system and the people operating it to limits that sometimes seemed beyond what human endurance and mechanical reliability could support. Aircraft flew in all weather conditions except when visibility dropped below absolute minimums that made landings impossible even with ground-controlled approach. Pilots flew multiple missions daily, landing at Berlin airports, waiting 30 minutes while cargo was unloaded and aircraft was refueled, then flying back to Western Germany to begin another cycle. The cumulative fatigue from flying hour after hour in all weather took severe tolls on pilots and crew who developed thousand-yard stares and who sometimes made mistakes born from exhaustion that they would never make when rested. The maintenance challenges were extraordinary, as aircraft that would normally be carefully maintained and flown limited hours were being operated beyond design specifications and beyond what manufacturers recommended for sustained operations. Engines wore out faster than peacetime experience predicted. Airframes accumulated stress from continuous operations in all weather. Components failed at rates that required mechanics to work miracles keeping aircraft flying despite part shortages and despite lacking ideal tools and facilities. The maintenance crews who kept the airlift flying worked shifts that exceeded human endurance limits, sleeping when they could between emergency repairs, improvising solutions when proper parts weren't available, and somehow keeping enough aircraft operational that tonnage requirements could be met despite mechanical breakdowns that would have grounded substantial portions of the fleet under normal circumstances. The coal deliveries represented the most challenging cargo for the airlift because Berlin's heating requirements during winter consumed enormous quantities, and because coal was heavy, dirty, and difficult to load and unload quickly. Each C-54 carrying coal required interior cleaning after unloading to prevent coal dust from contaminating other cargo or from creating health hazards for crews. The decision was made to dedicate certain aircraft exclusively to coal transport, accepting that these aircraft would require more intensive maintenance due to the harsh conditions, but simplifying logistics by not having to clean coal dust from aircraft that would subsequently carry food or medicine. The food supplies that sustained Berlin's population through the blockade included flour for bread production, dried goods, preserved meats, powdered milk, and other non-perishable items that could be transported efficiently and that could be stored for periods without refrigeration. Fresh foods like vegetables and fruits were luxuries that the airlift could rarely deliver given weight and space limitations. Berliners adapted to diets that were monotonous and nutritionally marginal, but adequate to prevent starvation. The calorie intake during the blockade averaged approximately 1,800 calories per day, barely sufficient for adults doing minimal physical labor and inadequate for growing children or for people performing heavy work, but enough to sustain life, if not health. The psychological impact on Berlin's civilian population was profound, as they lived through months knowing that their survival depended entirely on Western aircraft continuing to fly, and that Soviet forces could at any time take actions making the airlift impossible or could invade West Berlin if they decided the risks were acceptable. The sound of aircraft engines became the sound of survival, a constant reminder that the link to the West remained open, and that abandonment had not occurred despite Soviet pressure, and despite the enormous costs the airlift imposed on Western governments. Berliners who had experienced years of Nazi rule, followed by devastating war, followed by occupation, now found themselves pawns in superpower confrontation, dependent on the determination of distant governments to continue supporting them, despite no strategic or economic interests that would justify the costs under purely rational analysis. The political dimensions of the airlift extended far beyond Berlin, as the operation became a symbol of Western resolve and of the fundamental differences between democratic societies that would expend enormous resources to sustain civilian populations and communist systems that would deliberately starve cities to achieve political objectives. The propaganda value of the contrast was not lost on either side, with Western media extensively covering the airlift and portraying it as a humanitarian rescue of people threatened by Soviet aggression. Soviet media responded by claiming that Western powers were exploiting Berliners for propaganda purposes and that the blockade was justified response to Western violations of agreements about Germany's future. The human interest stories that emerged from the airlift captured public attention in ways that statistics about tonnages delivered or flight hours accumulated never could. Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, an American pilot who began dropping candy attached to small parachutes for Berlin children gathered near Tempelhof Airport, became famous as the Candy Bomber when his spontaneous gesture grew into an organized operation with American candy manufacturers donating supplies and with other pilots joining the effort. The candy drops, while trivial in terms of nutritional value or strategic significance, provided powerful symbols of Western caring about individual Berliners, and particularly about children who were suffering through circumstances they had not created and could not control. The German workers who supported airlift operations, loading and unloading aircraft at all hours in all weather, often worked under conditions that would be considered intolerable by Western labor standards, but that they accepted because they understood their work was essential to their city's survival. These workers, many of them women because war casualties had created severe shortages of working-age men, handled cargo with efficiency that impressed American and British supervisors, and that demonstrated work ethic that would later contribute to West Germany's post-war economic miracle. The cooperation between former enemies, Germans and Americans and British working together toward common goals only 3 years after war's end represented remarkable transformation of relationships and provided foundation for alliance that would characterize Cold War Europe. The Soviet response to the airlift evolved from initial confidence that the operation would fail within weeks to growing frustration as tonnages delivered steadily increased and as Berlin showed no signs of collapse or of population revolt demanding Western withdrawal. Soviet fighter aircraft conducted harassment operations, buzzing airlift transports and occasionally creating dangerous situations where collisions seemed imminent. But Soviet pilots were ordered not to shoot down Western aircraft, and the harassment remained below the threshold that would constitute acts of war, justifying Western military response. Soviet propaganda claimed that the airlift was failing, and that West Berlin faced imminent collapse, predictions that became increasingly disconnected from reality as airlift operations sustained the city month after month. The peak of airlift operations came on April 16, 1949, when 398 flights delivered 12,941 tons of supplies to Berlin in a single 24-hour period, demonstrating capabilities that had seemed impossible when the blockade began 10 months earlier. The Easter Parade, as the record day became known, saw aircraft landing at Berlin airports approximately every 30 seconds during peak hours, with the entire airlift organization functioning at maximum efficiency to achieve tonnages that exceeded Berlin's daily requirements by substantial margins. The achievement provided powerful evidence that the blockade had failed and that Western determination to sustain Berlin could not be broken through Soviet pressure that stopped short of military action. By spring 1949, Stalin recognized that the blockade was achieving nothing except demonstrating Western resolve and except undermining Soviet propaganda, claims about Western unreliability, and about the inevitable collapse of capitalism. The costs of maintaining the blockade in terms of Soviet reputation and international standing exceeded any conceivable benefits from continuing pressure that was clearly not forcing Western withdrawal. The Soviet decision to lift the blockade on May 12, 1949, came after negotiations that produced minimal Soviet gains and that represented clear Soviet diplomatic defeat. Even though Soviet statements claimed that Western concessions had been achieved and that Soviet objectives had been accomplished. The lifting of the blockade did not immediately end airlift operations because Western planners wanted to stockpile supplies in Berlin as insurance against future Soviet actions, and because the airlift had proven capabilities that made it valuable for maintaining supply levels above what ground transportation alone could provide. The airlift continued at reduced levels through September 1949, before officially ending, having delivered approximately 2.3 million tons of supplies during 15 months of operations. The statistics, while impressive, captured only part of the story, because the airlift's significance extended far beyond tonnages delivered to encompass what the operation demonstrated about Western capabilities and about Western political will to resist Soviet pressure. The human costs of the airlift operations totaled approximately 101 deaths, including pilots, crew members, and ground personnel who were killed in aircraft accidents during the sustained operations. The accident rate, while lower than might have been expected given the intensity of operations and the weather conditions frequently encountered, represented unavoidable tragedies that resulted from pushing aircraft and personnel to limits of human and mechanical endurance. Each death during the airlift represented sacrifice in service of objectives that, while important, were not traditional military objectives, dying to deliver coal and flour rather than dying in combat against armed enemies. The C-54 Skymaster aircraft that formed the backbone of the airlift fleet logged extraordinary hours during the operation, with individual aircraft accumulating flight time in 15 months that would normally represent years of peacetime operations. The wear and tear on aircraft was immense, with engines requiring replacement far more frequently than normal, and with airframe stress requiring extensive inspections and repairs. Many aircraft that flew the airlift were subsequently retired earlier than planned because the intensive operations had consumed their useful lives years faster than peacetime operations would have. The political consequences of the blockade and the airlift's success were profound for both Cold War dynamics and for Germany's future. The blockade demonstrated Soviet willingness to use extreme pressure to achieve political objectives and demonstrated that Western positions in Europe could not be defended through military force alone, given Soviet conventional superiority. But the airlift demonstrated Western technological capabilities and Western determination to sustain positions that were strategically important regardless of costs or difficulties. The success validated containment strategy that would characterize American Cold War policy for decades, holding positions against Soviet pressure while avoiding military confrontation that might escalate to nuclear war. For Germany, the blockade accelerated the division that would characterize German politics for 4 decades, making clear that reunification under any terms acceptable to both sides was impossible, and that separate German states would emerge from the occupation zones. The Federal Republic of Germany was officially established in May 1949 from the 3 Western occupation zones, creating West Germany as a democratic state aligned with Western powers. The German Democratic Republic was established in October 1949 from the Soviet occupation zone, creating East Germany as a communist state under Soviet domination. Berlin remained divided with West, Berlin becoming an enclave of democracy deep inside East Germany, a division that would be physically manifested by the Berlin Wall, constructed in 1961. The airlift's success established the United States as the guarantor of Western European security and created foundations for NATO, which was established in April 1949 during the final months of the airlift. The alliance formalized American commitment to defend Western Europe against Soviet aggression and established that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. The treaty represented American abandonment of traditional opposition to entangling alliances and reflected recognition that collective security arrangements were necessary to deter Soviet expansion, given that individual European nations lacked capabilities to defend themselves against Soviet military power. The technological innovations developed during the airlift influenced both military and civilian aviation for decades. The ground-controlled approach systems, the air traffic control procedures for managing high-density operations, the cargo handling techniques for rapid loading and unloading, and the maintenance procedures for sustaining high operational tempos all represented innovations that were subsequently adopted by civilian airlines and by military air transport forces worldwide. The Berlin airlift demonstrated that air transport capabilities could achieve objectives that had previously seemed impossible and established air logistics as fundamental component of military power projection. The Soviet lessons from the blockade's failure influenced subsequent Soviet approaches to Berlin and to Cold War competition more broadly. The recognition that Western positions could not be pressured through non-military means alone, and that Western responses to Soviet challenges might be more determined and more effective than anticipated, contributed to Soviet caution about direct confrontation with Western powers. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, represented a different approach to managing Berlin problem, accepting Western presence in West Berlin while preventing East Germans from escaping to the west through Berlin's open boundary, choosing physical division over continued pressure to force Western withdrawal. The veterans of the airlift, both aircrew who flew the missions and ground personnel who supported operations, carried pride in having participated in one of the most significant humanitarian operations in history, and in having demonstrated through sustained effort under difficult conditions that determination and organization could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable to skeptics. The reunions and commemorations held on airlift anniversaries brought together American, British, and German participants in celebrations that acknowledged their shared accomplishment and that recognized how the operation had affected subsequent history. The German memory of the airlift, particularly in Berlin, remains extraordinarily positive, with deep appreciation for the Western determination to sustain the city, despite enormous costs and despite no strategic necessity to maintain positions so far inside Soviet-controlled territory. The Luftbrückendenkmal, the airlift memorial at Tempelhof Airport, features 3 curved structures representing the air corridors and honoring those who died during operations. The memorial remains an important site for remembrance and for teaching younger generations about how Berlin survived the blockade and about the foundation that the airlift provided for enduring German-American friendship. The Tempelhof Airport itself, which was the primary destination for airlift flights, and which remains one of Berlin's most historically significant locations, was closed to aviation in 2008 but preserved as public space and as historical site where visitors can walk the runways where aircraft landed every few minutes during the airlift's peak operations. The preservation reflected German commitment to maintaining physical connections to the airlift and ensuring that future generations could visit the actual locations where history occurred rather than simply reading about events in books or seeing photographs. The comparison between the Berlin airlift and subsequent humanitarian air operations reveals how unique the airlift was in scale, duration, and strategic significance. Later operations, including humanitarian relief flights to various disaster areas, achieved important objectives and saved lives, but none matched the Berlin Airlift's combination of sustaining an entire city for 15 months, doing so in the face of active opposition from a superpower attempting to prevent success and achieving strategic objectives that extended far beyond the immediate humanitarian mission. The airlift remained the gold standard for air logistics operations, the demonstration of what could be achieved when determination, organization, and resources were combined toward clear objectives. The blockade and airlift represented the first major Cold War crisis, where superpower confrontation created immediate risks of escalation to military conflict, establishing patterns and precedents that would characterize subsequent crises, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall Crisis, and various confrontations over other global flashpoints. The peaceful resolution through determined application of non-military means set precedents for crisis management, emphasizing patience, sustained effort, and willingness to accept costs rather than yielding to pressure or resorting to military force that might trigger escalation beyond control. The economic costs of the airlift, while substantial, represented investments in preserving Western credibility and Western positions in Europe that paid dividends through subsequent decades as West Germany became NATO's most important European member, and as Berlin remained a symbol of Western determination to defend democratic values against totalitarian pressure. The approximately $224 million that the United States spent on the airlift, equivalent to several billion in current dollars, seemed expensive when measured against immediate costs, but proved to be sound investment when evaluated against strategic benefits achieved. The blockade's failure represented Stalin's most significant foreign policy defeat during the early Cold War period, demonstrating that Soviet conventional military superiority in Europe could not translate into political gains when Western powers responded with determination and creativity to Soviet pressure. The lesson apparently influenced Soviet approaches to subsequent confrontations, though the Soviet leadership never publicly acknowledged that the blockade had failed or that the airlift had succeeded in achieving its objectives despite Soviet efforts to prevent success. The participation of diverse groups in the airlift operations reflected the coalition nature of the effort and the shared Western commitment to defending Berlin against Soviet pressure. American aircrew and British aircrew worked side by side, sharing risks and sharing recognition for achieving objectives that neither could have accomplished alone. German workers provided essential ground support, despite having been enemies of the Western powers only 3 years earlier, demonstrating remarkable transformation of relationships and providing evidence that former adversaries could cooperate toward common goals when circumstances required. The children of Berlin who watched aircraft approaching Tempelhof Airport every few minutes during the airlift carried memories throughout their lives of how Western commitment had sustained their city during its greatest crisis, and how the sound of aircraft engines had represented hope and survival during months when their future seemed uncertain. Many of these children later became leaders in German politics, business, and civil society, and their experiences during the airlift influenced their strongly pro-Western orientation and their commitment to transatlantic alliance that would characterize West German policy throughout the Cold War. The airlift's conclusion in September 1949 marked transition from crisis operations to more normal patterns of supply and interaction between West Berlin and Western Germany, though the city's isolated position deep inside East Germany continued creating vulnerability and requiring Western commitment to defend access and to sustain the Western presence. The success of the airlift had demonstrated that commitment was real and that Western powers would accept costs and risks to maintain positions they considered strategically important, establishing credibility that would deter further Soviet challenges to Western positions in Berlin for years, until the very different challenge represented by the Berlin Wall required very different responses. The 15 months from June 1948 to September 1949, when the Berlin airlift sustained a city of 2.5 million people entirely by air against Soviet blockade, represents one of the most remarkable logistical and political achievements in modern history. The operation succeeded because of systematic organization, because of determination to continue despite difficulties and costs, because of technological capabilities that allowed sustained air operations at scales previously thought impossible, and because of political will to resist Soviet pressure, regardless of how long resistance required. The airlift demonstrated that Western values and Western capabilities, when combined with clear objectives and sustained commitment, could achieve results that changed the trajectory of history and that established foundations for peace and prosperity in Europe that have endured for decades following the Cold War's end.